Hi, let me first introduce myself. I'm an artist. I'm Korean. I lived in many different places for the past 16 years or so. Mostly educated in the US. Lived a few years in Europe. Studied Chinese for many years and spent some time in China. This year, I decided to come back and live in Korea. And this is very new for me because I left Korea and I left my family at a young age. Being back home where I was born in Daegu, which is a southern city in South Korea. And living so close to family is actually something quite new for me. My parents live in Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. But I decided to settle down in this island at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula called Jeju. We call it Jeju-do, and do means an island in Korean. There are many reasons why I moved to Jeju. First, it's a beautiful island, but also since the past almost 3 years, I've been working on this project about my grandfather. One of the big symbolic presence in that project is the ocean and water. I'm actually more, if you would say, a mountain person than an ocean person. My family is, my grandparents are Buddhist. So one of my happiest moments in my life are, when I was a child, are, going to the temple with my grandparents. And the smell that the temple had of the forest and also of the scent. I have a very sensorial memory of that, and so I've always loved hiking. And in relation to that, I've always had fear for water. The idea of not being able to control one's own body. I would used to say humans are not born to swim, or live in water. Where water has always been this big fear. Especially ocean, because ocean is something so vast, and similar kind of symbolic presence of ocean keeps appearing in my grandparents' project. And because I was working on this project, and it made sense that I am closer to the source of my project, which is my family and the history of Korea. This very famous Korean politician / intellectual / philosopher / artist, calligrapher named Kim Jong-hee. He had a lot of artist names, but one of it was Chusa. So Chusa Kim Jong-hee was exiled in Jeju Island for about 8 years or so. I thought, okay, I'm coming back to Korea, but almost like a self-exile. Similar to what Henry Thoreau did when before he wrote Walden. This idea to seclude yourself from society in certain ways, in order to see it more clearly, to have that distance. Long story short, all these different connections and thoughts led me to Jeju, and I just moved here 2 months ago. But I moved here thinking that I will build my base here, and how this island, the environment of this island, could shift my own preconceived knowledge. Why I said all this? It's to, of course, say hello. This is who I am, and I decided to obviously start this YouTube channel. I don't know that many people here. I'm very obviously disconnected from the local language and the culture because I lived abroad for so long. But I still have this strong sense of connection to this land and the history, and so I thought it would be nice if I share my experience of living in Jeju with people from outside, English speaking audience, whether in Korea or outside of Korea. I thought that's something that I could do as someone Korean, someone bilingual, someone who knows the history a bit and has family here and lived here, but also a bit of a stranger to this particular island and whatnot. What I'm gonna use as a tool to connect this somewhat random island with my life and your life is with books. That's why I'm sitting in front of my bookcase. Since I was always at a place where I was somewhat out of place, because I didn't know their culture fully, their language, their attitudes, and what to say, and how to be comfortable. Where I found comfort is in reading, because it's something very intimate, but intimate with another person's words. Okay, this introduction got way too long, but essentially this channel is me reading some books and sharing what I think about the book that I read. And you can just listen or participate and write some comments and stuff like that. I thought could be a good way to connect to the outside world, outside of this island. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I read this book in high school. I read it again in Jeju because I started teaching these two kids who goes to international school in Jeju, and it's a reading and discussion class, and our second book. So our second book is this I chose. This book was written in 1960, but is set in 1930s, early 1930s, the Great Depression time. Sometimes reading a book that you read when you're young and then reading it again when you're an adult is an interesting thing. To Kill a Mockingbird. I've never heard this phrase before I read the book first time, and then when I was reading it again, I had to recollect and do some research about what the title really symbolizes and how that is the crux of this book is really this title. The mockingbird basically symbolizes people who are innocent, people who doesn't do any harm to other people. And mockingbirds are beautiful songbirds. They're not one of those invasive species. They're very, I suppose, innocent in that manner. So what does it mean to kill the mockingbird? It means almost like a sacrifice. You're sacrificing the innocent. At the end of the day, it doesn't do good to anybody. It doesn't do good to the mockingbird because the mockingbird is dead, but it also doesn't do good to the world. Essentially, it actually does harm because then you cannot hear the beautiful songs anymore, right? Even though this book is written in 1960 and it's a classic and many people have read it, but it's still happening today. I mean, I guess we never learn from history. I mean, there's still so many incidences around the world, in Korea also, where we are so cruel to those who are innocent. I kept thinking, and I also told my students that, you think this is so long ago, but it's happening today in the US, the police brutality and the whole issue of caravans coming from South America and characterizing outsiders as invaders, even though if you look at American history, the original immigrants of the United States were also invaders, right? They invaded the land that the Native Americans were occupying. And the book also points out at one point the hypocrisy by actually mentioning Hitler. I didn't remember that part. When I was reading back, I was actually quite shocked that this was mentioned in the book. This book was set in early early 1930s, that's when Hitler really came into power, right? And so very relevant. The way this book mentioned it was through the main character, Scout, the little girl, takes this class called Current Events class. Her classmate brought this article about what Hitler is trying to do with the Jewish people. Her teacher really engaged with this subject and says, yes, how awful these Nazis are. They're being discriminatory towards Jewish. This is wrong. So on and so forth. Scout goes to her father, Atticus, and shares with him that when Atticus's trial was over, the trial that he was defending this black man, Tom Robinson, when they lost and when everybody was walking out of the court, Scout heard her teacher say, oh, now they should learn their lesson. They, meaning black men, that how dare they now think they can marry a white woman, now this should put them in place. Remembering this, Scout feels so troubled by the hypocrisy, right? The hypocrisy of her teacher, who was so passionate to defend Jewish people from discriminating against Nazis because of whether it's their ethnicity or religious identity, but could not acknowledge how she is discriminatory towards black people. 2/3 into the book, it becomes more and more, I would say somewhat didactic, because in the beginning it kind of sets it as like a mystery, like a childhood mystery, There's this, strange person in the neighborhood and the kids are trying to figure out who this person is, and to meet this person, there's a whole myth around this, like a Halloween kind of story, right? The book kind of starts off as this kind of childhood mystery, and these three kids are trying to figure out in their own childhood world, in that innocent world, what is evil, what is good, and what is scary, and what is who you can trust. But then the book really goes deep into not only the local issue of this town, but also expanding it into larger American history, and then expanding that into social and political issue of the world. I find the structure of this book quite interesting in that way, and very done very successfully. This kind of starting from very symbolic, almost like very small story, to expand, and you see this big picture of what's going on and how much that this little girl can connect all these dots that's happening in her time. Of course, this little girl is not real and is a character in the book written by Harper Lee, but you start to imagine being this girl, and even though Atticus appears to be this kind of righteous man, a hero, the important details and emotional connection that is necessary in solving really difficult racial, ethical issues are carried out by this little girl Scout. This is from chapter 11. Scout, said Atticus, when summer comes, you'll have to keep your head about far worse things. It's not fair for you and Jem, I know that, but sometimes we have to make the best of things and the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down. Well, all I can say is, when you and Jem are grown, maybe you'll look back on this with some compassion and some feeling that I didn't let you down. This case, Tom Robinson's case, it's something that goes to the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man. Atticus, you must be wrong. How's that? Well, most folks seem to think they're right and you're wrong. They're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to full respect for their opinions, said Atticus. But before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. It's very powerful, I think. I don't know. a person's conscience. It's interesting how the writer set public education almost against a real, true education that is that comes from Atticus for Scout. Almost sets her as this kind of advanced kid who is kind of beyond this standardized education. Essential learnings in this book for Scout actually doesn't come from school but from her father. I often think today school is really not about education. It's really about, advancing yourself so that you can get to the top no matter what. It's really not about becoming someone who is part of this world that is connected to everybody else. It's really not about becoming a good human being that will benefit all, not one. That's why sometimes in this book, the conversation between Atticus and Scout is very powerful, because I feel like Atticus tries to do the right thing, and also for him, why this is so important, he says in the later part of the book, is because he wants to look at his own children straight into their eyes and not be ashamed. In a way, Atticus is a symbol, is a metaphor for that kind of figure, right? The figure who's embedded in system and knows the limits, but still tries to do the right thing. Oh, there's a scene on chapter 20. There's a scene with this man, Mr. Raymond. So it's a controversial figure, I think, because this figure has black mistresses, and he's known to be crazy and always hanging out with them, and has half black children. And for people, this is something very unacceptable and kind of consider him not part of society in certain ways. I find it very controversial, this figure itself. I could see why the writer plugged him in to kind of defend the outsiders of society. I personally felt like, oh, this could be an artist, or not always, but, like for me, this could be something that I could engage in, not with his character, but this whole idea of being an outsider of society, like doing things that you think is not hurting other people and you're living by your own standard, but society just judges you because you're not living like everybody else. So he comes to see the court case of Tom Robinson, and he has like a drink in his hand, and people think that it's alcohol, that people consider him, he's a drunk and he's crazy, that's why he has all these black mistresses and he's always hanging out with them. But he reveals that it's actually Coca-Cola that he's drinking, and he offers to Scout. Mr. Raymond chuckled, not at all offended, and I tried to frame a discreet question. Why do you do like you do? Oh yes, you mean why do I pretend? Well, it's very simple, he said. Some folks don't like the way I live. Now I could say the hell with them. I don't care if they don't like it. I do say I don't care if they don't like it right enough, but I don't say the hell with them, see? Dylan and I said, no, sir. I try to give them a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. When I come to town, which is seldom, if I weave a little and drink out of this sack, folks can say Dolphus Raymond's in the clutches of whiskey. That's why he won't change his ways. He can't help himself. That's why he lives the way he does. That ain't honest, Mr. Raymond, making yourself out better than you are already. It ain't honest, but it's mighty helpful to folks. Secretly, Miss Finch, I'm not much of a drinker, but you see, they could never understand that I live like I do because that's the way I want to live. I had a feeling that I shouldn't be here listening to this sinful man who had mixed children and didn't care who knew it. But he was fascinating. I had never encountered a being who deliberately perpetrated fraud against himself. But why had he entrusted us with this deepest secret? I asked him why. Because you're children and you can understand it, he said. The climax happens on Halloween event, right? Mr. Ewell attacks the kids, Scout and Jem, and ends up dying. And there's the most important scene between Mr. Heck, who is the sheriff, and Atticus after this happened, after they found out that Mr. Ewell was dead. And the scene happens second to last chapter, where it brings up this title, Mockingbird, by Scout. So you can see how Scout as a character also evolved throughout this book. Because in the beginning, she didn't really understand what To Kill a Mockingbird means. But she uses it herself to her father. Because Atticus refused to believe that Ewell just fell on the knife and killed himself. He says this must be Jem. If Jem was the one who stabbed him, essentially, even though it was self-defense, he should say it and admit that, yes, I stabbed this man. And that's the only way to move forward. Mr. Heck is adamantly saying, no, it was Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. I have proof. I'm the sheriff. But at the end, because Atticus is so stubborn about this position, that Mr. Heck just says, let the dead bury the dead. And that was very powerful because it shows that maybe also Mr. Tate didn't have all the evidence to prove this. Maybe we'll never know. No one will ever know. In the end, Mr. Heck's best argument, there are two dead people, let it be buried with them. Atticus finally says, all right. But he still feels he's not convinced. He also has his character limits, right? So very reluctantly, he faces Scout and asks her. And this scene is, I think, is very powerful. So I'll start from what Mr. Finch said. There is a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it's dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead. Mr. Tate went to the swing and picked up his hat. It was lying beside Atticus. Mr. Tate pushed back his hair and put his hat on. I never heard tell that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. But maybe you'll say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Know what happened then? All the ladies in Maycomb, including my wife, be knocking on his door bringing angel food cakes. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different. But not this man, Mr. Finch. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole in the floor with the toe of his boot. He pulled his nose, then he massaged his left arm. I may not be much, Mr. Finch, but I'm still sheriff of Maycomb County, and Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Good night, sir. Mr. Tate stamped off the porch and strode across the front yard. His car door slammed and he drove away. Atticus sat looking at the floor for a long time. Finally, he raised his head. Scout, he said. Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand? Atticus looked like he needed cheering up. I ran to him and hugged him and kissed him with all my might. Yes, sir, I understand, I reassured him. Mr. Tate was right. Atticus disengaged himself and looked at me. What do you mean? Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? Atticus put his face in my hair and rubbed it. When he got up and walked across the porch into the shadows, his youthful step had returned. Before he went inside the house, he stopped in front of Boo Radley. "Thank you for my children, Arthur," he said. Very powerful. So if Ewald didn't kill himself, then there's two suspects, right? One is Jem and one is Boo Radley, and both are Mockingbirds. Boo, if he did it, he was only trying to save the kids. And Boo, from the end of the book, is described as this adult person, but doesn't have full capability as an adult. Let's say if Jem did it, and Jem is just a kid. If he did it, it was real self-defense. And Scout just caught it. She said, well, wouldn't that be like killing a mockingbird? So that's the end of the book. To Kill a Mockingbird. Even if you have read it when you were a kid, I would really recommend reading it again. It was really fun for me. I mean, like fun in the sense of it's really stimulated my mind. It's very relevant and it's very important, really important classic to read, I think, especially for Americans, but also, again, for international readers also. So, all right, that's my first session. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I can't guarantee when I'll be back with the second session, but hopefully it's soon.